The chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of crystalline architecture that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Admiral Richard Hayes stood at the center of a circular platform, surrounded by representatives from 200 different species. Above him, holographic images of 1,000 more worlds watched in silence. The air itself felt heavy with judgment as the ancient chamber prepared to deliver its verdict on humanity. Richard had known this moment was coming for months. The signs had been clear enough. Trade agreements canceled without explanation. Human ships turned away from stations that had welcomed them for decades. Ambassadors recalled under the thinnest of pretenses. The galaxy had made its decision long before this trial began. This gathering was merely theater, a way for the powerful to justify what they had already chosen to do. Captain Helen Morris stood 3 paces behind him, her diplomatic credentials stripped away the moment they had entered the chamber. She had spent 5 years building bridges between humanity and the other species, 5 years of careful negotiation, of finding common ground, of proving that humans could be trusted partners in the great galactic community. All of that work had crumbled in a matter of weeks when the accusations began. The Zephrani magistrate floated forward, its crystalline body catching the light and scattering it in rainbow patterns across the assembled crowd. The being had no face as humans understood such things, but Richard could sense its contempt radiating outward like heat from a star. When it spoke, its voice echoed from every surface, impossible to ignore or escape. Humanity stood accused of 17 violations of the Galactic Accord: unauthorized colonization of border worlds, aggressive expansion into disputed territories, the use of prohibited weapons during conflicts with minor species, trading with civilizations that had been formally sanctioned by the Council. The list continued, each charge more dubious than the last. Richard had read the actual laws. Humanity had broken none of them. They had simply grown too fast, too strong, too confident for the comfort of species that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. The vote came swiftly. Of the 200 species represented in the chamber, 197 voted for exile. 2 abstained. 1, the Keltharn delegation, voted against the measure. Richard made a mental note to remember that kindness. The Keltharn were a small species, barely noticed by the greater powers, but they had shown more courage than civilizations that commanded hundreds of star systems. The magistrate pronounced the sentence with obvious satisfaction. Humanity would have 30 days to evacuate all territories within the galactic border. Their colonies would be seized and redistributed among the loyal species. Their trade networks would be dissolved. Any human vessel found within galactic space after the deadline would be destroyed without warning. The Council would erase every trace of human presence, as if they had never existed at all. Lieutenant Jake Morrison watched the proceedings from the observation deck of the orbital station. His hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Around him, other junior officers stood in similar poses of barely controlled rage. They had all believed in the galactic dream, the promise that any species could find a place among the stars if they proved themselves worthy. That promise had been revealed as a lie. The galaxy did not want partners. It wanted subjects. The evacuation began within hours. 300 human ships gathered at designated rally points throughout the border regions. Captain Helen Morris coordinated the massive undertaking from the bridge of the flagship Resilience, her voice calm and steady, even as she watched decades of human achievement being torn apart. Families made impossible choices. Some chose to stay behind, accepting alien rule rather than face the unknown darkness beyond the galactic rim. Others packed what little they could carry and joined the growing exodus. Commander Lisa Park managed the logistics, her mind racing through calculations of cargo capacity, fuel reserves, and life support limitations. 300 ships could carry perhaps 2 million people, but there were 5 million humans spread across the border colonies. The math was simple and brutal. Not everyone could come. Selection criteria had to be established. Priority went to children, to skilled workers, to those with knowledge that would be essential for survival. The rest would have to take their chances under alien occupation. Richard stood on the bridge of the Resilience as the fleet prepared for departure, watching the tactical display that showed human vessels gathering from across the sector. Each blip of light represented hundreds or thousands of lives, people who had trusted humanity's leaders to protect them and guide them to a better future. He had failed them all. The weight of that failure pressed down on him like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. Helen joined him at the viewport, her reflection visible in the transparent aluminum. Her face looked older than it had that morning. New lines carved by stress and grief. She had always been the optimist, the one who believed that reason and diplomacy could solve any problem. That faith had been shattered in the council chamber. What would replace it, Richard could not yet say. The fleet began its journey 3 days before the deadline. Richard saw no reason to give the council the satisfaction of watching humans scramble in panic at the last moment. The ships formed up in tight formation, their drives flaring in unison as they accelerated away from the galaxy that had rejected them. Behind them, alien forces already moved to occupy the abandoned colonies. The transition of power would be swift and efficient. Within a week, it would be as if humans had never been there at all. The journey to the galactic rim took 6 weeks, each jump carrying them further from everything humanity had built. The ships traveled through increasingly empty space, passing dying stars and failed worlds that held no interest for the great civilizations. This was the frontier that nobody wanted, the region of space that even the most desperate colonists avoided. Ancient star charts labeled it as empty space, a cosmic desert where nothing lived and nothing ever would. But as the fleet emerged from their final jump, Lieutenant Jake Morrison made a discovery that would change everything. His sensors detected something impossible, a star system, young and vibrant with multiple planets in the habitable zone, a place where humanity might not just survive but thrive. He forwarded the data to the flagship immediately, his hands shaking with something that might have been hope. Richard studied the readings with growing interest. The galaxy had cast humanity aside, believing them to be a minor annoyance easily forgotten. But exile might prove to be the greatest gift their enemies could have given them. Out here in the darkness, away from the watchful eyes of the Council, humanity would be free to become something new, something stronger, something the galaxy would never forget. The region beyond the galactic rim had a name among the few species who knew of its existence. They called it the Abyss, and their ancient texts warned against venturing into its depths. According to the oldest records, civilizations that traveled too far into the darkness simply disappeared, leaving behind no trace of their passage. The Galactic Council had marked these territories as forbidden zones on their star charts, regions to be avoided by any sane captain. Now those forbidden zones were humanity's only home. Commander Greg Sullivan led the first scouting mission into the nearest star system, his small frigate accompanied by 2 escort ships. The sensor readings had seemed too good to be true, and Greg had learned long ago that anything too good was usually hiding something terrible. His crew remained at battle stations as they approached the inner planets, weapons charged and shields at maximum strength. Whatever lived out here in the darkness, humanity would not be caught unprepared. The first planet they surveyed exceeded all expectations. Gravity at 0.9 standard, atmosphere composition within acceptable parameters, liquid water covering 40% of the surface. The planet could support human life without extensive terraforming. But it was the ruins that captured everyone's attention. Vast cities sprawled across entire continents, their towers still reaching toward the sky despite millions of years of abandonment. Whatever species had built them had possessed technology far beyond anything the current galactic powers could create. Dr. Amy Chen practically vibrated with excitement as her team descended to the surface. She had spent 20 years studying ancient civilizations, piecing together the rise and fall of species long forgotten by the galaxy. This discovery represented the pinnacle of her career. The architecture defied easy categorization, seeming to blend organic and mechanical elements into something wholly unique. Materials that should have crumbled to dust long ago remained intact, resistant to time and weather in ways that human science could not explain. The real treasure lay beneath the surface. Amy's team discovered an entrance to an underground complex that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The facility had its own power source, still functional after an incomprehensible span of time. Emergency lighting activated as they entered, illuminating corridors wide enough to drive a vehicle through. The walls were lined with panels of crystalline material that pulsed with soft blue light, as if the building itself were alive and aware of their presence. Captain Vincent Cole supervised the establishment of the first permanent settlement on the planet they designated Haven. The prefabricated structures brought from the fleet looked crude and primitive, next to the alien architecture, but they would serve until something better could be built. Within weeks, 2,000 colonists had transferred down from the overcrowded ships. Children played in streets that had been empty for longer than humanity had existed. Gardens began to grow in soil that had never known human touch. But the priority remained exploration of the ancient complex. Lieutenant Sarah Price led the engineering teams deeper into the facility, following corridors that branched and merged in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. They discovered manufacturing centers with equipment that had no obvious purpose, control rooms filled with displays showing information in languages nobody could read. And everywhere, the crystalline matrices that seemed to be the heart of the entire system. Sarah had always been good with machines. She could look at any piece of equipment and understand its function, see how its parts fit together to create a working whole. But this technology operated on principles she could barely grasp. The controls responded to thought as much as touch. The power systems drew energy from dimensions that human physics said should not exist. Attempting to understand it felt like trying to hold water in her bare hands, possible in theory, but frustratingly difficult in practice. Dr. Amy Chen made the breakthrough 3 months into the exploration. She had been studying the crystalline matrices, trying to determine their purpose. The breakthrough came when she realized they were not machines at all, but storage devices. Each crystal contained more information than every computer in the human fleet combined. And they were designed to be read, their content structured in a way that any sufficiently advanced species could access and understand. The knowledge contained in those crystals was staggering. Weapon systems that could tear holes in reality itself, shield technology that existed partially outside normal space, propulsion systems that would make the journey from one side of the galaxy to the other in a matter of days rather than months, medical technology that could extend lifespans indefinitely, and repair damage that human doctors would consider impossible to treat, all of it waiting for someone to find it and put it to use. Richard made the decision that would define humanity's future during a council meeting with his senior officers. They could use this knowledge to rebuild what they had lost, recreate the civilization the Galactic Council had taken from them, or they could use it to become something greater, something that would make their exile meaningless. The vote was unanimous. Humanity would not beg for readmittance to galactic society. They would forge their own path, build their own empire, and one day return to show the galaxy what a terrible mistake it had made. The first human-built warship incorporating the ancient technology launched from Haven's orbital shipyards 10 months after the exile. They called it Titan I, and it bore little resemblance to the ships that had carried them into darkness. The hull was constructed from materials that could repair themselves, adapting to damage and growing stronger with each engagement. The weapons could strike targets light seconds away with perfect accuracy. The shields could absorb energy from incoming attacks and redirect it to the ship's own systems. Commander Lisa Park took the new ship through its shakedown cruise, testing each system against progressively more difficult challenges. The Titan performed beyond even the most optimistic projections. In simulated combat against vessels of the type the Galactic Council used, it could engage and destroy targets at a ratio of 50-1. And this was just the first generation of the new technology. Each month brought new improvements, new capabilities, new ways to push the boundaries of what was possible. Greg Sullivan led expeditions to other systems throughout the region, discovering more ruins and more knowledge. The ancient civilization had been vast, spanning hundreds of star systems. They had achieved heights of power and prosperity that made the current galactic powers look primitive by comparison. Yet they had vanished, leaving behind only their cities and their knowledge. Amy spent her nights studying the records, trying to understand what had happened to them. The answer when she found it was both inspiring and terrifying. The ancient ones had not died. They had transcended, leaving behind physical existence to become something else entirely. The technology they left behind was a gift or perhaps a test for whatever species might come after them. A way for younger civilizations to follow in their footsteps, if they proved themselves worthy. The knowledge was there for the taking, but it came with a warning. Power without wisdom led only to destruction. Species that rushed to embrace the technology without understanding its implications inevitably destroyed themselves. Richard considered that warning as he watched the fleet grow. Every month brought new ships, each more advanced than the last. The population on Haven had swelled to 50,000, and new colonies were being established on other worlds throughout the region. Humanity was transforming, becoming something new under the pressure of exile and the influence of ancient knowledge. Whether that transformation would lead to transcendence or destruction remained to be seen. 5 years had passed since the fleet arrived in the abyss, and the transformation of humanity was complete. The refugee flotilla that had limped away from the galaxy now seemed like a distant memory, a relic of a weaker time. Admiral Nicole Grant stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Navy headquarters, watching new warships emerge from the shipyards that now orbited Haven. The production facilities ran day and night, each dock producing vessels at a rate that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Nicole had been a junior captain when the exile began, commanding a small patrol vessel on the frontier. Now she led a fleet of 3,000 warships, each one capable of challenging entire squadrons of the vessels that galactic powers considered cutting edge. The crews were different too, harder and more disciplined than the peacetime Navy she remembered. Exile had burned away any illusions about the universe being a safe or fair place. These men and women knew that survival depended on strength, and they had embraced that truth completely. General Paul Dixon watched his troops conduct exercises on the surface of Haven, their movements precise and coordinated. The soldiers wore armor that made them look more like machines than humans, powered exoskeletons that multiplied their strength tenfold and contained enough weapons to level a small city. Energy rifles that could punch through any known armor. Personal shields that could deflect everything short of a direct hit from a starship weapon. Drop pods that could deploy entire battalions from orbit in less than 5 minutes, putting soldiers anywhere on a planet before defenders could react. The training was brutal by the standards of the old Federation military. Soldiers spent 6 months in basic training, learning not just how to fight but how to think like warriors. They studied ancient military campaigns from human history, learning lessons from commanders who had faced overwhelming odds and somehow emerged victorious. They practiced with their equipment until using it became as natural as breathing, and they learned to embrace the harsh reality that in the galaxy beyond their safe borders, mercy was often mistaken for weakness. Helen Morris had transformed as much as anyone. The diplomat who had pleaded for understanding before the Galactic Council no longer existed. In her place stood Chancellor Helen Morris of the Terran Empire, a leader who understood that power commanded more respect than words ever could. She wore her new title without hesitation, having learned that the universe only listened to those strong enough to make themselves heard. Democracy still existed within the Empire, but it was balanced by military efficiency and the hard lessons learned through exile. The government structure had evolved to meet the challenges of their new reality. The old Federation, with its endless committees and bureaucratic delays, had been replaced by something leaner and more focused. Leaders were chosen based on competence rather than popularity. Decisions were made quickly and implemented immediately. There was no room for political games when survival itself remained uncertain. And yet the people supported this new system, recognizing that it served them better than the old ways ever had. Dr. Charles Webb led the research division that continued unlocking secrets from the ancient civilization. Every week brought new discoveries, new applications of technology that pushed the boundaries of what humanity could achieve. The medical advances alone had revolutionized life in the Empire. Diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries were now easily cured. Injuries that would have been crippling could be repaired in hours. The average human lifespan had already increased by 20 years, and the projections suggested it would continue rising. But it was the star map that changed everything. Charles and his team had discovered it deep within the crystalline archives, a complete survey of the universe as the ancient ones had known it. The revelation shocked everyone who saw it. The Galactic Council, those beings who believed themselves masters of creation, controlled less than 1% of the total space available. Thousands of galaxies remained unexplored, unclaimed, waiting for someone bold enough to venture into the unknown and seize them. Commander Lisa Park, now holding the rank of admiral, proposed a plan that was ambitious even by the standards of their transformed civilization. Humanity would continue expanding outward, away from the galaxy that had rejected them. They would build a network of fortress worlds and industrial centers, stretching across the abyss and into the void beyond. When they finally returned to face the Galactic Council, it would be with resources and military strength that no combination of species could hope to match. The expansion began immediately. Scout ships pushed further into unexplored space, identifying suitable worlds for colonization. Colony ships followed, carrying everything needed to establish self-sufficient settlements. Within 2 years, humanity controlled 40 star systems, each one contributing to the growing strength of the Empire. Mining operations extracted resources on a scale that would have been impossible with old Federation technology. Automated factories produced ships, weapons, and equipment without requiring human oversight. Vincent Cole supervised the construction of fortress worlds along the Empire's borders. These were not normal colonies, but military installations designed to withstand any assault. Orbital defense platforms that could destroy approaching fleets before they entered weapons range. Planetary shields strong enough to withstand bombardment from orbit. Garrison forces that could deploy anywhere on the planet within minutes. Any enemy that tried to invade the Empire would find themselves fighting for every meter of ground against defenders who knew their terrain perfectly. Jake Morrison had risen to the rank of captain and commanded one of the new Titan-class destroyers. His ship, the Vengeance, patrolled the outer systems, watching for any sign that the Galactic Council had noticed their activities. So far, the galaxy remained ignorant of what grew in the darkness beyond their borders. The Council had forgotten about humanity, dismissed them as extinct or irrelevant. That ignorance was humanity's greatest advantage. Sarah Price continued her work with the engineering teams, pushing the technology to its limits and beyond. Each generation of warships was more advanced than the last. Each iteration of the weapon systems hit harder and more accurately. Each improvement to the shields made them more resistant to damage. The rate of progress was staggering, compressing decades of normal development into just a few years. And they were nowhere close to understanding everything the Ancient Ones had left behind. Amy Chen published her findings about the ancient civilization, and her conclusions troubled many who read them. The Ancient Ones had not simply transcended because they were ready. They had transcended because they had no other choice. Their technology had grown so powerful that remaining in physical form had become dangerous, not just to them but to the entire universe. They had faced a choice between ascending to a higher plane of existence or destroying everything they had built. The warning was clear. Humanity was following the same path. Richard, now in his 60s but looking decades younger thanks to the medical advances, considered Amy's warnings carefully. He understood the danger. Power without wisdom led to destruction. But he also understood that weakness led to extinction. The galaxy had taught humanity that lesson when it cast them aside. The question was whether humanity could become strong enough to survive while remaining wise enough not to destroy themselves in the process. The Terran Empire had become something the galaxy had never seen before. A civilization born in exile, forged in darkness and tempered by the knowledge of those who had come before. They controlled technology that made them effectively invincible by the standards of current galactic powers. Their military could challenge any fleet that might be assembled against them. Their economy produced wealth at rates that seemed impossible, and all of it remained hidden from the species that had cast them out. 20 years had passed since the Galactic Council pronounced judgment on humanity, and in that time the galaxy had moved on. The human colonies had been redistributed among the loyal species, their technology studied and copied, their contributions to galactic civilization quietly absorbed and credited to others. Among the 200 species that made up the Council, humanity was remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. The exile had been justified, necessary, and ultimately successful in maintaining galactic order. The arrival of the Harbinger shattered that comfortable narrative. The ship appeared at the edge of Zephrani space without warning, its sudden emergence from hyperspace catching the border patrol completely by surprise. The vessel itself was unlike anything in the galactic database. Its hull seemed to flow like liquid metal, constantly shifting and reforming in response to some unknown stimulus. Energy readings fluctuated across spectrums that should not have been possible, and when the border patrol attempted to scan its interior, their sensors simply failed, unable to penetrate whatever shielding protected the ship. Captain Derek Palmer sat in the command chair of the Harbinger, his expression calm as the Zephrani ship surrounded his vessel. 23 warships, each one larger than the human ship, their weapons charged and ready. In the old days, before the exile, such a display of force would have been terrifying. Now it was simply amusing. Derek opened a channel to the Zephrani fleet commander, and delivered the message he had been sent to convey. The Galactic Council would assemble at their central station within 30 days. A human delegation would present terms for a new relationship between humanity and the galaxy. Any attempt to interfere with human ships or operations would be considered an act of war, and responded to accordingly. The message was simple, direct, and allowed no room for negotiation. Derek closed the channel without waiting for a response. The Zephrani fleet commander did what his training and experience told him was correct. He ordered an attack. 23 warships opened fire simultaneously, their combined firepower enough to reduce a small moon to debris. Energy beams and missiles converged on the Harbinger from every direction, a coordinated strike designed to overwhelm any defensive system. The weapons struck their target and exploded in a brilliant display of light and energy. When the light faded, the Harbinger remained completely undamaged. The attack had accomplished nothing. Derek allowed himself a small smile before activating the ship's offensive systems. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. The Harbinger moved through space with impossible grace, its weapons reaching out to touch Zephrani ships with surgical precision. Hulls split open as if cut by invisible blades. Shield systems overloaded and exploded. Propulsion units failed, leaving ships drifting helplessly. Derek was careful not to target life support or crew sections. The goal was to send a message, not commit genocide. When the last Zephrani warship limped away with its weapon systems destroyed and its hull breached in a dozen places, Derek sent one more transmission. He provided coordinates for the wreckage and information on where survivors could be found. Then the Harbinger jumped back into hyperspace, leaving the Zephrani to contemplate what had just happened. The message was clear. Humanity had returned, and they were no longer the desperate refugees of 2 decades past. Admiral Richard Hayes led the main fleet into the galaxy 3 days later. 500 Titan-class destroyers emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, accompanied by 2,000 support vessels. The fleet did not attack anything or anyone. It simply existed, hanging in space near the major trade routes where every species with ships would see it and understand. The display was more effective than any weapon. Here was proof that humanity had not just survived exile but had thrived, growing stronger than anyone could have imagined. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, their chambers filled with panic and confusion. The various species representatives argued among themselves, trying to understand how this could have happened. Humans had been cast out with primitive technology and limited resources. They should have died in the abyss or at best eked out a marginal existence on whatever dead worlds they could find. Instead, they had returned with technology that made them effectively invincible by current galactic standards. Some council members advocated for immediate military action. Every fleet in the galaxy should be assembled and sent to crush the human threat before it could grow any larger. Others urged caution, pointing to the destruction of the Zephrani border patrol as evidence that conventional tactics would not work. A few species, those with long memories and wisdom earned through centuries of observation, recognized that the galaxy had created this situation through its own arrogance and fear. Chancellor Helen Morris addressed the council from the Bridge of the Resilience, her image broadcast across 1,000 worlds. She wore the formal robes of her office, black trimmed with gold, the symbols of the Terran Empire displayed proudly. Her words were measured and calm, but the message they carried was devastating. Humanity had no interest in rejoining the galactic community, as supplicants begging for acceptance. That time had passed. Instead, she offered the council a choice: submit to human authority and accept integration into the Terran Empire under terms that would be negotiated individually with each species, or refuse and face the full military might of humanity, a force that had been built specifically to ensure that never again would any power be able to threaten human survival. The choice was theirs to make, but they had only 30 days to decide. After that deadline, humanity would assume that any species not actively seeking peace was choosing war. Commander Greg Sullivan led diplomatic missions to individual species throughout the galaxy, offering them deals tailored to their specific circumstances. The approach was sophisticated and showed deep understanding of galactic politics. Some species had chafed under the dominance of the larger powers, forced to accept unfavorable terms because they lacked the strength to resist. To these species, humanity offered alliance and protection. Others had grown wealthy and comfortable under the current system. To these, humanity offered the chance to retain their prosperity in exchange for cooperation. The Keltharn were among the first to accept human terms. They remembered voting against the exile, and saw in humanity's return a chance to reshape the galactic order into something more just. Their ambassador met with Greg aboard the Resilience, and the two worked out an agreement that would serve as a model for other species. The Keltharn would retain complete autonomy over their internal affairs but would contribute resources and technology to the Empire in exchange for military protection and access to human markets. Not all species were receptive to human overtures. The Zephrani refused all contact, still bitter over their defeat at the hands of a single human ship. The Draxian Confederacy, one of the largest military powers in the galaxy, began assembling its fleets for war. A dozen other species followed their example, believing that unity in numbers would overcome whatever technological advantages humanity possessed. They were preparing to learn a very painful lesson. Jake Morrison commanded a scout squadron that shadowed the assembling enemy fleets, gathering intelligence on their capabilities and intentions. The enemy was being predictable, following standard galactic military doctrine that had not changed in thousands of years. They were assembling a massive force designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Trusting in the reliability of proven tactics, Jake sent his reports back to Admiral Nicole Grant, who incorporated the intelligence into her battle planning. The galaxy teetered on the edge of chaos. The old power structures that had maintained order for millennia were crumbling as species chose sides. Some declared for humanity, seeing opportunity in the new order. Others remained loyal to the Council, preparing for war, and a few tried to remain neutral, hoping to avoid the coming storm entirely. But neutrality was becoming impossible. Humanity demanded a choice, and the deadline was approaching fast. Richard watched the developments from his quarters aboard the Resilience, monitoring reports from across the galaxy. He felt no satisfaction in what was coming. War had never been his goal, but the galaxy had left humanity no choice. They had cast out an entire species for the crime of being too successful, too ambitious, too unwilling to accept limits on their growth. Now humanity would show them the consequences of that decision. The assembled armada at the Crossroads Nebula represented the greatest concentration of military force the galaxy had ever seen. 10,000 warships from 140 different species, their combined crews numbering in the millions. The fleet stretched across space for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, a wall of metal and weapons designed to destroy anything that stood against it. The Council species had put aside their traditional rivalries and conflicts to face what they saw as an existential threat. Humanity would be crushed, and galactic order would be restored. Admiral Nicole Grant studied the tactical display aboard the command ship Emperor's Will, noting the positions and classifications of every enemy vessel. The Council fleet outnumbered her forces 20-1, an advantage that would have been decisive in any conventional engagement. But this would not be a conventional engagement. Nicole had spent 5 years preparing for this exact scenario, running simulations and war games until she understood every possible variation of how the battle might unfold. The enemy was predictable, locked into tactics that had worked for thousands of years. That predictability would be their downfall. The human fleet consisted of 500 Titan-class destroyers, supported by 2,000 lighter vessels. The formation was loose and spread out, appearing almost casual compared to the rigid battle lines favored by galactic powers. To an observer unfamiliar with human tactics, it might have seemed like a sign of poor discipline or inadequate training. In reality, it was the most efficient deployment for the weapon systems the human ships carried. Each vessel could engage targets across millions of kilometers, rendering traditional close formation combat obsolete. The Council fleet advanced in a massive wedge formation, the heaviest ships at the front and lighter vessels protecting the flanks. It was a classic maneuver, one that had been used successfully in countless battles throughout galactic history. The plan was simple. The heavy ships would absorb the initial human attack while pushing forward to engage at close range, where their numerical advantage would tell. Light vessels would sweep around the flanks to catch the humans in a crossfire. It was sound doctrine, proven effective against every enemy the Council had ever faced. Nicole waited until the enemy fleet had committed fully to their approach before giving the order to engage. The human ships activated their primary weapon systems, and space itself seemed to tear apart. Beams of pure energy reached across the void, bypassing conventional defensive shields to strike directly at the cores of enemy vessels. Ships that had taken decades to build and millions of credits to outfit simply ceased to exist. Their matter converted to energy in an instant. The Council fleet's front line evaporated before it had closed even half the distance. General Paul Dixon commanded the ground assault component of the operation from his flagship Warhammer. While the space battle raged, his forces deployed to strategic worlds throughout the galaxy. Drop pods rained down from orbit, each one carrying a full squad of soldiers in powered armor. The pods were designed to penetrate any planetary defense, using the same technology that allowed human weapons to bypass shields. By the time defending forces realized they were under attack, human soldiers were already on the ground and engaging targets. The battle for the Zephrani homeworld lasted 3 hours. The defenders fought bravely, using every tactic their military academies had taught them. But they were fighting an enemy that operated on principles they could not understand. Human soldiers moved too fast, their armor absorbing damage that should have killed them. Their weapons struck with impossible accuracy from ranges that exceeded anything in the Zephrani arsenal. Squad tactics that had worked against other species failed, completely against humans who communicated with each other through direct neural links. Captain Vincent Cole led the occupation forces that secured conquered worlds. His orders were clear. Species that surrendered would be treated fairly and with respect. Their governments could continue functioning under human oversight. Their cultures would be preserved and protected. But those who continued to resist would face increasingly harsh measures until submission became the only viable option. Vincent took no pleasure in the work, but he understood its necessity. The galaxy needed to learn that humanity could be generous in victory, but ruthless when opposed. The space battle at Crossroads Nebula reached its conclusion after 6 hours of continuous combat. Of the 10,000 ships that had begun the battle, fewer than 2,000 remained operational. The survivors were scattered and disorganized, their command structure shattered and their will to fight broken. Nicole ordered her forces to cease fire and transmitted an offer of surrender. The remaining Council ships could withdraw unmolested, or they could continue fighting and be destroyed. Every ship that could still maneuver chose withdrawal. Chancellor Helen Morris addressed the galaxy from the Council chambers themselves, standing in the very spot where humanity had been condemned to exile 20 years earlier. The Zephrani magistrate, that being of crystalline energy, who had pronounced judgment with such satisfaction, now stood before her in restraints designed to contain its unique physiology. Helen could have ordered its execution, and few would have objected after the casualties the war had inflicted. Instead, she offered it a position as an advisor to the new imperial government. The message was carefully calculated. Humanity was strong enough to destroy any who opposed them, but wise enough to show mercy to defeated enemies. The species of the galaxy needed to understand that integration into the Empire offered benefits that outweighed the loss of complete independence. Trade networks would expand, bringing prosperity to worlds that had been isolated. Technology would be shared, raising living standards across entire civilizations. And most importantly, the protection of the Imperial military would ensure that never again would powerful species prey upon the weak. Not every species accepted human terms willingly. The Draxian Confederacy continued fighting for another 3 months, their stubborn pride preventing them from acknowledging defeat. Each battle followed the same pattern. Draxian fleets would assemble and advance, confident that this time their numbers and determination would overcome human advantages. Each time, Nicole's forces would shatter them with minimal casualties. Eventually, the Draxian civilian government overthrew their military leadership and sued for peace. Admiral Richard Hayes retired to Haven 1 year after the war ended. He had accomplished what he set out to do. Humanity was safe, strong, and respected throughout the galaxy. The species that had once cast them aside now paid tribute and sought favor. It was more than he had dared hope for during those dark days when the exile fleet first arrived in the Abyss. He spent his final years writing a comprehensive history of the exile and return, ensuring that future generations would remember both the injustice that had been done and the mercy humanity had chosen to show. The Terran Empire stretched across the galaxy, encompassing 500 star systems and 187 different species. The economy boomed as trade barriers fell and technology spread throughout the empire. Species that had fought wars over resources for thousands of years now found themselves with access to wealth beyond their ancestors' dreams. The imperial military ensured peace, its mere existence enough to prevent the conflicts that had once been routine. Dr. Amy Chen continued her research into the ancient civilization, now with resources that would have seemed impossible during the early days on Haven. She discovered that the transcendence the Ancient Ones had achieved was not the only path forward. Other options existed for civilizations that reached the threshold of godlike power. Humanity could choose to transcend, or they could choose to remain physical and simply accept the responsibility that came with their strength. The choice belonged to future generations. Captain Derek Palmer commanded the exploration fleets that pushed beyond the boundaries of the known galaxy. The star maps left by the Ancient Ones showed thousands of galaxies waiting to be explored, each one potentially containing resources, knowledge, and perhaps even other civilizations. Humanity had conquered one galaxy, but the universe remained vast and full of possibilities. Some within the Empire advocated for continued expansion, while others argued for consolidation of existing territories. Sarah Price became director of the Imperial Research Division, overseeing thousands of scientists and engineers working to understand and improve upon the ancient technology. Progress continued at a rapid pace with new breakthroughs announced regularly. But Sarah never forgot Amy's warnings about the dangers of power without wisdom. She implemented strict protocols for testing new technologies, ensuring that each advancement was thoroughly understood before being deployed. The goal was not simply to become more powerful, but to become wiser as well. The transformation of the galaxy was not without cost. Billions had died in the war, and countless more had their lives disrupted by the change in galactic order. Some species thrived under human rule while others struggled to adapt. Resistance movements formed on a few worlds, groups that refused to accept the new reality, and fought guerrilla campaigns against imperial forces. These rebellions were suppressed, sometimes harshly, but they served as a reminder that not everyone